In the final days of 1945, when the thunder of the Second World War had faded into uneasy silence, the world found itself trembling before a new and uncertain order. Victory had brought no comfort. Across the ruins of Europe, a deeper fear took root, the sense that conflict had merely changed its shape. The Soviet Union expanded its sphere of influence. Alliances shifted like unstable sand, and secrets, military, political, scientific, became treasures more valuable than any metal. And in that fragile moment, the United States understood a haunting truth. Power alone could not guarantee safety. The Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence arm of America, had been dissolved only months earlier. Its disappearance left Washington feeling suddenly blind. Behind closed doors in the White House and the Pentagon, anxious voices circled the same question again and again. Who would guard the nation against threats that could not be seen? That answer arrived in the summer of 1947, when Congress passed the National Security Act. With it, the Central Intelligence Agency was born, a creation forged not in celebration but in apprehension. It was an admission that the coming age would not be defined by armies marching openly across continents, but by hidden struggles waged in silence. Allen Dulles and the early architects of the agency envisioned a force unrestricted by borders or traditional military rules. They believed that, to shield the United States, they would need to act in ways the public might never fully understand. From its first breath, the CIA carried within it a paradox, a mission to defend democracy through methods that rarely resembled it. By the end of the 1940s, as the Cold War tightened its grip on global affairs, the CIA expanded quietly, almost imperceptibly. Windowless buildings appeared in Washington like monuments to secrecy. Locked steel cabinets filled with classified files lined dark corridors. Young officers, sworn to silence, vanished overseas under assumed identities. The world's most powerful republic had crafted a hidden blade, one meant to strike without leaving fingerprints. No one outside a small circle knew what the CIA truly did, and few possessed the authority to ask. Its operations unfolded not in daylight, but in carefully cultivated darkness, where decisions of immense consequence were made far from public view. Thus, an invisible empire took shape, silent, disciplined, and steeped in mystery. From that moment on, world history would be reshaped not only by presidents or generals, but also by the unseen hands moving behind sealed doors. And the deeper one looked into those shadows, the more one realized that the line between protection and manipulation had already begun to blur. As the Cold War tightened its grip on the world, the Central Intelligence Agency stepped beyond its quiet beginnings and entered a far more aggressive phase. The late 1940s and early 1950s were defined by a single conviction inside Washington, that invisible battles would decide the fate of nations long before any soldier set foot on a battlefield. Within this worldview, the CIA discovered its most potent weapon, the covert operation. These operations were born from a fear that open confrontation with the Soviet Union would ignite a third world war. To avoid that catastrophe, the agency forged a strategy based on stealth. Instead of armies, it deployed whispers. Instead of declarations, it relied on denial. A small circle of planners, often meeting behind locked doors, decided which governments would rise, which leaders would fall, and which corners of the globe would be bent toward American interests, all without a single public vote. In the early years, two operations became the blueprint for many others. In the Middle East, the agency helped orchestrate the overthrow of a prime minister whose attempts to nationalize his country's oil fields threatened Western influence. In Central America, the agency supported a campaign that toppled a president viewed as sympathetic to left-leaning movements. Both missions were conducted quietly, with front companies, coded messages, and agents whose identities were buried under layers of denial, and both reshaped entire regions in ways still felt generations later. These victories, celebrated in private briefings, carried a powerful lesson. Covert action worked. It was cheaper than war, faster than diplomacy, and left Washington free to deny responsibility. Soon, the agency's mandate expanded. It funded political parties, trained guerrilla fighters, spread propaganda, and guided opposition groups in countries far from American shores. With each operation, the agency's confidence grew. And so did its belief that history itself could be engineered from the shadows. Yet critics in Congress and the press began to raise questions. How much power should an agency have if its successes can never be publicly acknowledged and its failures never fully explained? What happens to democracy when decisions with global consequences are hidden behind classified files? These concerns were met with silence, for the Cold War left little room for hesitation. To many inside the agency, transparency was a luxury the world could not afford. By the end of the 20th century's first decade, the CIA had transformed from a young intelligence service into a global force capable of altering the political destiny of entire nations. Its actions, buried beneath secrecy, created a legacy both formidable and deeply controversial. And though the public knew only fragments of the truth, the world had already entered an era shaped by the unseen hand of America's most shadowed institution. By the mid-1970s, the United States found itself in a moment of uneasy self-reflection. The nation had endured the turmoil of the Vietnam War, the shock of the Watergate scandal, and a rising suspicion that powerful institutions had wandered too far into the darkness. Amid this atmosphere of doubt, one question echoed across Washington. What had the Central Intelligence Agency truly been doing behind closed doors? The answer began to emerge when Congress established the Church Committee in 1975, the first major attempt to shine a public light into the agency's hidden chambers. Named after Senator Frank Church, the committee summoned witnesses, opened locked archives, and forced the agency to confront its own past. What unfolded before the American public was not a simple catalog of operations, but a portrait of a clandestine world operating on the thin line between national duty and unchecked authority. One revelation centered on surveillance programs aimed not at foreign adversaries, but at American citizens. For years, the agency had collected correspondence, intercepted communications, and monitored activists under the broad justification of protecting national security. What had begun as wartime caution evolved into a system that blurred the boundary between external threats and domestic dissent. Another discovery shook the nation even more deeply: the existence of covert psychological experiments conducted over several decades. These programs attempted to understand, and in some cases manipulate, the human mind. Though many files had already been destroyed, fragments that remained suggested a level of ambition far beyond what the public had imagined. Historians later described this as a reminder of how secrecy can distort purpose, bending even well-intentioned missions into ethically hazardous territory. Declassified documents also revealed that the agency had, at times, operated without the full knowledge of presidents or congressional oversight. This autonomy, once considered an asset in the chaotic early years of the Cold War, now appeared dangerous. It raised a disturbing possibility that a powerful arm of the government could move silently through world events, guided by objectives known only to a select few. Yet the story was not one of simple condemnation. Many defenders argued that the agency acted under extraordinary pressures, facing an adversary whose own methods were equally opaque and ruthless. They insisted that intelligence work, by its very nature, required risk, secrecy, and uncomfortable choices. Still, the revelations prompted a national reckoning. By the end of 1976, reforms began reshaping the landscape of American intelligence. New oversight committees were formed, legal boundaries were clarified, and the darkest programs were officially discontinued. But even as rules tightened, a haunting question lingered. Could any system truly restrain an institution built on secrets? The Church Committee had pulled back the curtain, but it could not fully illuminate the labyrinth behind it. The shadows remained, quieter, perhaps, but still alive, waiting for another moment when history would once again force the truth into the open. The morning the towers fell, America awoke to a new kind of fear, a fear without borders, uniforms, or flags. In the smoldering aftermath of that September morning aswang, the CIA stood at the crossroads of history, forced to abandon the slow, chess-like maneuvers of the Cold War and confront an enemy that lived in the gaps between nations. Nothing in the agency's past prepared it for what came next, a world where danger could be whispered across satellite phones, hidden in encrypted messages, or carried by a single traveler with a forged passport. Almost overnight, the CIA reshaped itself into a hunter of phantoms. Field officers were pushed into remote deserts, chaotic borderlands, and forgotten mountain ranges where no treaties or rules offered protection, intelligence gathering became a race against time, where scraps of intercepted conversations or a name scribbled in a notebook could mean the difference between a thwarted attack and another national tragedy. The sense of urgency was overwhelming, and in that pressure, the agency entered moral terrain darker than anything it had walked before. Secret detention sites, locations deliberately erased from maps, appeared across continents. Inside them, interrogations stretched the boundaries of law and conscience. Supporters insisted such methods were necessary in a war without fronts. Critics argued they betrayed the values the United States claimed to defend. Within the agency, officers wrestled with a silent question: how far must one go to protect a nation? And when does protection become something else entirely? As technology advanced, the battlefield shifted again. Drone strikes redefined warfare, allowing the CIA to eliminate threats from thousands of miles away. Yet each strike carried the weight of unseen consequences: political backlash, civilian casualties, and the haunting uncertainty of whether a target was truly who the intelligence claimed. The drone became both a symbol of American precision and a reminder that power exercised from afar could never be fully controlled. Meanwhile, conflict brewed within the American intelligence community itself. The FBI accused the CIA of guarding information too tightly. The NSA gathered data so vast it threatened to overshadow traditional human intelligence. The Pentagon fought for control over counterterrorism operations. Rivalries once hidden became open fractures. And cooperation often depended not on strategy, but on fragile personal alliances. By the end of the decade, the CIA had transformed, no longer merely a collector of secrets. It had become an architect of covert wars, a global analyst, a technological powerhouse, and a political lightning rod. Its victories were celebrated only in quiet hallways. Its failures were broadcast across the world. In this new era, the agency discovered that the most dangerous enemies were not always those hiding in distant caves, but the invisible consequences of its own expanding power. And as the world changed faster than any intelligence system could track, one truth became clear: the shadows the CIA fought were no longer outside. They were woven into the very fabric of modern conflict, inseparable from the institution itself. By the early 21st century, the Central Intelligence Agency stood at a crossroads more daunting than any moment in its shadow-laden history. The Cold War was a distant memory. The War on Terror had reshaped its mission, and new rivals, states, hackers, corporations, even rogue actors without a flag, were rising in ways that old intelligence doctrines could not contain. Yet the question that echoed most persistently through the halls of Washington was one few dared to answer aloud. Could the agency remain powerful without slipping further into the darkness that had defined it for nearly 8 decades? Inside its headquarters, analysts confronted a world transformed by invisible threats. Cyber attacks could paralyze governments in minutes. Disinformation campaigns could fracture societies without firing a shot. And artificial intelligence was quickly becoming both a shield and a weapon. The agency understood that the battleground of the future would not be waged with spies in trench coats, but with algorithms, encrypted networks, and silent wars fought in the unseen corners of the digital world. To survive, the CIA had to evolve yet again, quietly, decisively, and far from the public eye. But evolution came at a cost. Critics argued that expanding technological power would grant the agency unprecedented reach into private lives and foreign systems. Congressional committees demanded more transparency. Civil groups warned of a future where secrecy overshadowed democracy itself. Each inquiry raised the same dilemma: how much darkness should a republic tolerate in the name of its own safety? The agency's defenders countered that sunlight, though noble calm, could not illuminate every battlefield. They insisted that intelligence work required shadows, that enemies thrived in obscurity, and that total transparency would leave the nation exposed. In their view, the CIA remained a necessary guardian, a force willing to absorb the moral weight others refused to carry. As global tensions sharpened and new powers challenged American influence, the agency found itself returning to familiar tools: covert influence, deep analysis, alliances forged in silence. But unlike the early days of the Cold War, the world now watched with sharper eyes and louder voices. Every operation risked becoming a scandal, every misstep a diplomatic tremor. Yet despite the scrutiny, one truth persisted. The CIA's story was entwined with the story of American power itself. It had shaped revolutions, toppled governments, broken terrorist networks, and intercepted threats long before they reached American shores. Its greatest victories were buried in classified archives, its darkest mistakes carved into global memory. And so, as the 21st century marched forward, the agency stood neither as villain nor hero, but as something far more complicated, a creation of fear, ambition, idealism, and necessity, a guardian forged in crisis, operating forever in the half-light between duty and danger. In the end, the Central Intelligence Agency remained what it had always been, a silent force moving behind the curtain of history. Its future, like its past, would be written in whispers. And whether those whispers protected the world or haunted it would depend on the choices made in the shadows, choices the public might never truly see.